Welcome to session 299 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 26th of October. Today we'll be looking at 1 Corinthians 1-2 and Psalm 139. But first of all, let's get an overview of 1 Corinthians. Our next letter, 1 Corinthians, is a letter written by Paul to the church in Corinth. It was likely written in 56 CE during the last year of his 3-year ministry in Ephesus. We read as Paul planted the church in Corinth in Acts 18. While this letter is titled 1 Corinthians, it is likely Paul's second letter to the church. In his travels, he'd heard reports about bad things going on in the church in Corinth, and so he wrote his first letter to them, which we don't have. They then responded to Paul with another letter that we don't have, most likely justifying their behaviour and explaining why Paul was wrong. In his second letter to them, Paul addresses more reports he'd had about their behaviour and then addresses their letter. The issue with this is it means we're getting only half the conversation and have to try to piece together what it is that Paul is replying to. Here is a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself, particularly as today there are two. But we start with the first 9 verses of chapter 1, which is the introduction. And then from verse 10 all the way through to the end of chapter 6 is Paul addressing the reports he's heard about the Corinthians. And this section can be split into two, with chapters 1-4 all being about the church divided, and then chapters 5-6 all about the immorality that is happening in the church. Then in the next section, chapters 7-15, we have Paul addressing the letter that he'd received from the Corinthians. And this is split into kind of 6 different topics. We have chapter 7, which is the questions around marriage, chapters 8-10, which is all about mixing with idols, and the first half of chapter 11, which is about women in worship, the second half of chapter 11, which is about the Lord's table, chapters 12-14, the abuse of spiritual gifts, and then finally chapter 15, the resurrection. And this all then leads to conclusion in chapter 16. One of the key issues in the church in Corinth was the impact of Greek thinking. The Greeks believed the most important thing about a human was the spirit. And the body was physical, and physical meant bad. At best, it should be ignored, and at worst, it should be suppressed. Because of this thinking, the Corinthians had become hyper-spiritualized, while at the same time either suppressing their bodies or not worrying about the sin they did with their bodies because they believed the bodies just didn't matter. This flowed into various issues like sexuality, eating food that had been dedicated to other gods, and their views on the resurrection. Paul will address these issues with a proper understanding of the body. Because of their hyperspirituality, the Corinthians had also become proud. They believed that they had earned their spiritual gifts with their impressive spirituality and were constantly chasing after teachers who could teach them to be more spiritual. This bled into how they treated one another and how they used their spiritual gifts to promote themselves. Paul will address these issues with a reminder that spiritual gifts are exactly that, gifts from God. He also brings some order into how they are to use their spiritual gifts. Paul wants them to see that because they have become wise and powerful in their own sight, they've actually become foolish, and that God's power is now weak in them. They've allowed themselves to become divided when instead they should be pursuing unity. But for now, let's jump into today's reading, 1 Corinthians 1-2. As with Romans, Paul starts his letter by introducing himself as an apostle and introduces Sosthenes. It's unclear who Sosthenes is. It may be that he was a ministry partner of Paul, or that he was the one who wrote 1 Corinthians for Paul, just like we read about Tertius who wrote Romans. Paul then addresses the readers themselves. He describes them as those sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be saints. That's 1 Corinthians 1 verse 2. Sanctified means to be made holy, and saints can also be translated as holy ones. These Corinthians have already been made holy by Jesus, and they are called to be holy ones. And this is an interesting description from Paul when we look at how they are behaving further on in the book. However, the point still stands. They have been made holy by Jesus, and they are called to live in that holiness. Paul then gives thanks for the Corinthians. They are enriched in all speech and knowledge. They are not lacking in any gift. These people are highly skilled and effective people, but Paul wants to make very clear to them that everything they have has come from Jesus. It is all gifts from him. The Corinthians didn't become skilled and effective by themselves. Then we jump into the meat of the letter. We've already mentioned that the Corinthians were constantly chasing after whatever teacher would make them more spiritual or more wise in their own eyes. This often led to infighting as they argued over who was the best teacher. Paul addresses this division. These teachers aren't the source of the Corinthians' freedom. Jesus is. And they shouldn't be divided by teachers when they're meant to be united in Jesus. Paul is grateful that he didn't baptize any of the Corinthians, because he knows that they would then argue over who baptized them and how that made them more special. So Paul targets the root of the issue. They're chasing after teachers because they think they are wise or eloquent. That's the wrong way to think about it. Paul himself purposely tried not to come with his own wisdom or eloquence because he didn't want that to overshadow the Jesus that he was talking about. The good news of Jesus is not wise as the world sees it. A Messiah that came to save the world by dying on a cross makes no sense to how a first century Greek saw the world. Paul quotes Isaiah 29 verse 14 to point out that God intentionally subverts the wisdom of the world. In all of its wisdom, the world was not able to know God, so he chose unwise means to make himself known. The Jews' weakness is that they are constantly looking for signs. The Greeks' weakness is they are constantly chasing after wisdom. But the Christian believes in a crucified Messiah, which is an issue for both Jew and Greek. The reality is God's foolishness is wiser than any human wisdom, and his weakness is stronger than any human strength. In short, if they are trying to pursue wisdom using the world's understanding of wisdom, they're going to end up foolish. Paul then appeals to their own history. Not that long ago, the Corinthians were a ragtag bunch. They were not considered wise or powerful or noble. In many ways, Corinth wasn't like the noble aristocratic Greek cities that we tend to think of. The city had been destroyed by the Romans 200 years before, and left as rubble for 100 years. Then, 100 years later, 100 years before this letter was written, the Romans re-established it as a Roman colony. It was settled predominantly by freedmen, ex-slaves who were trying to make their mark. Its city was not made of impressive buildings, but tightly packed houses, workshops and stores. It was these people, likely working-class individuals with low standing and low influence, that initially made up the church in Corinth. Whatever influence and standing they have since gained has been given to them because of Jesus. And so if they're going to boast, then they need to do it in Jesus. Paul himself did not preach to them with great rhetoric and wisdoms. He simply preached Jesus crucified and allowed the power of the Spirit to demonstrate the truth of his words. And therefore, those who are mature in Jesus shouldn't seek to show off their wisdom. Paul is cleverly attacking their pride here. He is insinuating that because they do seek to show off their wisdom, they must not be mature. The spirit of the world only knows human wisdom. As Christians, we have the Spirit of God, and so we should not seek wisdom, but seek more of the Spirit. Those who are seeking human wisdom do not receive the gifts the Spirit is offering, but those who seek the Spirit understand the nature of the Spirit and the mind of Christ. But that is 1 Corinthians 1-2. Now let's look at Psalm 139. This psalm is attributed to King David and falls into the category of lament psalm, though it may not seem it at first. We've mentioned before that the lament psalms are about bringing your complaint to God, asking him to do something, and then declaring your trust in him. This psalm spends the first 3/4 of the psalm declaring their trust in God and his great power. It's only in the last quarter that the psalmist then brings their complaint and request. Here's a summary of the structure. We have verses 1-6, the Lord is all-knowing. Verses 7-12, the Lord is all-present. Verses 13-18, the Lord as creator. And then verses 19-24, vindicate me, O Lord. And the psalmist starts by declaring that the Lord has searched them and knows them. Whatever the psalmist does or thinks, the Lord knows about it. Even before the psalmist says a word, the Lord knows what they are going to say. This means that the Lord can hem the psalmist in by guiding their steps and keeping them safe long before trouble is at hand. The idea of all this is almost too much for the psalmist. They can't quite comprehend how the Lord can know them so intimately. It may be that this knowledge scares the psalmist a little, but they realize there's nothing they can do. There's nowhere that they can run from the Lord. The Lord is in the heavens and in the pits of Sheol. Sheol was the Old Testament understanding of where you go when you die. And they could travel towards the morning, to the east, or to the farthest limits of the sea. For the Israelites, this was seen as the far side of the Mediterranean to the west. But the Lord would still be there guiding them and leading them. Even if they hid somewhere really dark, the Lord can see in the dark just as well as he can in the light. This leads the psalmist to think about how it was the Lord who created them. The Lord knows how all the internal organs work, because he was the one that knit them together when the psalmist was in their mother's womb. The psalmist marvels at the Lord for being able to do that. The Lord saw everything that was going on in their mother's womb, and even then knew the full extent of the psalmist's life. Again, this idea is too much for the psalmist to think about or comprehend. This then finally leads the psalmist to bring their complaint and their request. The psalmist is clearly surrounded by wicked people that oppose them and oppose God. The psalmist asks that God deal with their enemies. They point out to God that they have been loyal to him, hating those that God hates and those that turn away from God. The unspoken question is, if the psalmist is doing what they should be doing, why are they being persecuted like this? The psalmist then ends with a request that God search them and point out anything that is wicked in them so they can deal with it and live right. The psalmist's struggle is that they are surrounded by wicked people persecuting them and they don't know why. So they first build this logical understanding that God sees all and knows all, and then ask God to either deal with the problem or point out where they've misunderstood something. This is an incredible prayer. It shows humility to recognize this seems wrong to me, but it may be that I'm missing something that God can see. This humility and teachability means that we can both ask God to intervene with our problems, but also give him space to work on us if we're the problem. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.